Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for logging on today for the culmination of my independent study on the nonprofit crunch, the financial and community pressures in an era of uncertainty. I had a really great time taking on this study and learning a lot more about a sector that I work in from the higher education side, but also just getting to know it better for my hometown. Before I get started, just want to share some housekeeping. I have a very hefty presentation, but my goal is to break it down for anybody, whether you're in the nonprofit sector or looking to learn more about a major sector of our region. As I'm going through it, I'm happy to answer any questions. You can drop them in the chat or utilize the Q&A function, and I'll do my best to multitask and see any questions that pop up. And I'll go ahead and get started here. I'm sharing my screen. All right. Just a quick introduction of who I am and why I'm talking about nonprofits. Before I came to RIT, in my early career, I had the pleasure of working with the Hershey Company. And part of being a Hershey employee is learning Milton Hershey's story. And not only did he find some really great chocolate products, but he also was a great philanthropist. And his riches from finding Hershey's chocolate and Reese's peanut butter cups, among other great delights, had built and influenced the town. And he also put his wealth towards funding the Milton Hershey School, which was initially an orphanage for young boys, but has grown today to serve more children in need. Next in my career, when I worked at Trogs Brewery, the founders were really cognizant of their impact on the community. And I had the pleasure as the marketing events coordinator to partner with them on community efforts and working with regional and local groups from our township officials to the YMCA and even art museums to connect our business of beer with their public interests. And that was a really fulfilling experience. On the side, from a volunteering side, I had previously volunteered my time for Habitat for Humanity, Stop Hunger Now, and Dress for Success. And then when I uprooted to Rochester to move closer to my new family, I was getting to know the area, and my most recent endeavors have been local micro fundraising efforts for the Tour de Teddy for Camp Good Days, as well as participating in the Walk for ALS to support research initiatives with the ALS Foundation. So with all that, how did I get to this independent study? What started as a casual conversation then sparked an initiative to begin a massive community project. I also found this as a really great opportunity to explore the nonprofit landscape that we have in this great region. And if there's anything I've learned from the MBA, it never hurts to ask. And I saw the opportunity to use this starting point to also get potentially be an independent study. So I would really like to give some thank yous to Lydia Palmer for sparking that conversation, Jerry and Puskas and Christina Gullo for being a part of that conversation and sharing their insights from the industry. And with RIT, thank you to Bill Dresnick for giving me the official permission to do my independent study, John Strebeck for being my faculty advisor, and Peggy Terrell for being my back-end advisor. The way I like to approach this conversation is starting by taking a step back and assessing the big picture of how we got to where we are today. And it was helpful to define the structures of the nonprofit entities, reviewing the history, at least the American history, and then after laying that groundwork, focusing in on the Rochester region with some more statistics and considerations for moving forward. The first fund definition is defining the actual structure of the nonprofit. Nonprofit is a term used interchangeably, but from diving deeper, especially when you dive into the IRS website, there are a lot of different distinctions. The important distinction of a 501c3 and another 501c is that a 501c3 must demonstrate that their organization serves public interest. We have some great local examples of 501(c)(4)s and 501(c)(6)s who are nonprofit, but for the purpose of this study are not included in the assessment. For 501(c)(3)s, we have some great Lions Club, homeowners associations, and veterans associations in our area. And in 501(c)(6), I actually utilized a lot of these groups' research material, which include economic development organizations, chambers, and interestingly enough, the NFL is one of those. But interesting with a 501(c)(3), while there is the push for public interest, what that public interest is still a very broad term, as you can see from the text on the slide. And but the core has always been religious organizations, organizations that focus public testing for public safety, the furthering of science and research, and education, as well as preventing cruelty to children and animals. Other key distinctions here is in terms of political activity, a 501(c)(3) is strictly prohibited in participating in any kind of political endeavors, where 501(c)(4) and 501(c)(6) have a little more flexibility, but of course with some guidelines. The funding sources for a 501(c)(3), as we are all talking about in 2025, government grants and contracts are a big portion for some nonprofits, but it's the second largest source of the main three. Private fee-for-service revenue for many nonprofits is their primary source. What's coming in behind is the culmination of public donations, foundation grants, and investment income. What's very interesting about the government grants and contracts is that of the nonprofits that receive funding for that, the majority of them have higher revenue than the ones that are operating at a smaller scale. The graph on the right was pulled from the Urban Institute to demonstrate nonprofits that participated in their study that received funding from federal grants and/or contracts. So an important distinction there is you could have a nonprofit in this group that is contracted to do work for a government entity, but did not, and just the contract. So that's still considered a payment from the government, but not designated as a grant. Still comes up as federal funding, especially when payment time comes and if the government is running behind on their payment process. Then the average percentage of nonprofit revenue that came from government agencies, you can see it increases the larger the revenue is for a nonprofit entity. Getting into the early history of nonprofits, what I think is really interesting to start here, and I'll summarize, is that we operate under the assumption that government and nonprofits are so deeply intertwined, but looking back at the very beginnings, that has not always been the case. Over these next few slides, these are just a very abbreviated American history, but through the lens of nonprofit, the growth of philanthropy, and evolving government and the involvement of government. At the beginning of the American Revolution, when the founding fathers were finding America, they also first established nonprofits since they were escaping some of the intertwined nuances that was in British Columbia. The first nonprofits were established and they were intended to be independent of government and yielding services. The main causes were religious, but other services were founded. The Civil War was the first time that government truly acted through leveraging certain nonprofits as agents of the state. This particular example was that the federal government commissioned the U.S. Sanitary Group to provide health care to Union soldiers during the war. Post-war and major innovations in industry then fueled philanthropy. Millionaires jumped from 4,000 to 40,000 in a span of 20 years. And luckily, those millionaires were feeling very generous, and they began the pay it forward public persona. And if you notice, a lot of universities and hospitals and other great entities, they're established in the late 1800s, early 1900s. This is exactly why. We have great millionaires like in our region, George Eastman, Milton Hershey, who I alluded to earlier, and the Rockefellers are another notable one who led the philanthropic charge of establishing foundations and also acting as a source of good, still acting independently with their wealth. Then the first community foundation was established in 1914 in Cleveland, which also helped foster collective giving to balance the funding sources. Unfortunately, that didn't balance it quite enough. Government would still sneak in, and some nonprofits would still have undefined causes, which brought up the means for regulation. The case of Jackson versus Phillips was a landmark case that demonstrated that donations had been rejected when there was direct political action, but then there were gifts allowed for an entity to shape public opinion. Since those lines were blurred, this case made the line clearer. There was also a few revenue acts that passed through. So this is where we have to thank for the tax exemption status, as well as the tax deduction for public contributions to organizations, as well as further defining the distinction of education and advocacy so that they could have their tax exempt status. In the Great Depression, President Hoover was the first president that had his first test of taking the partnership further with government and nonprofits. While his effort was short-lived, since the demand significantly overwhelmed the supply, this moment was set as the time that set off the trajectory of nonprofit and governmental interdependence over time. Then a big war happened, and post-World War II, the critical evolution of nonprofits happened. Post-World War II was when nonprofits began to take on globalization efforts that were very much supported by our government, which also, again, changed their trajectory of their original intent. For some modern milestones with this partnership and debate, that the funding source also entered, where not only were governments directing nonprofits to administer services on their behalf, but they were also funding them since they saw the need for these services to be provided. This brought up a lot of debates about how nonprofits should serve and where's the line on funding then dictating power over an entity. 1971 through 1976 were important milestones that very much shape where we are today. We saw that during that time, government funding matched the amounts that private giving was supporting nonprofits for. You had 23.3 billion in government funding, almost matching 25.3 billion in philanthropy and services. And at the same time, there was a major increase in government contracts going from 25% to 50% of social services allocated to nonprofits. In 1993, the globalization continued with AmeriCorps being established, but expanding to national service. And the early 2000s then brought back another resurgence of philanthropy through the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, which actually also changed the trajectory of prioritizing a direct investment into local communities, bypassing government involvement. And this final slide, this is just a very quick visual of how nonprofits and government were working together, starting as independent entities, but over time becoming more ingrained. And even though I show the interdependence, government has the funding, nonprofit is then told to execute the services. Where we are today, that back and forth and that evolution of the government and nonprofits relationship has led to, as we're experiencing right now, some imploding conflict. From the book Philanthropy in America, the federal government wants to encourage philanthropy, but it's also less at ease with philanthropy's entry into the realm of policymaking, and it has proven hostile to its efforts at advocacy, seeing its own prerogatives challenged directly. And then this has also influenced some restrictive public perception of how nonprofits should operate. This is what Dan Pallotta speaks about in his book, his TED Talk, and documentary Uncharitable. One of his great quotes from that is, "When you prohibit failure, you kill innovation. If you kill innovation in fundraising, you can't raise more revenue. And if you can't raise more revenue, you can't grow. And if you can't grow, you can't possibly solve large social problems." Having a restrictive view on how nonprofits operate, combined with limiting them to a source that's no longer serving them, has created quite a challenge for nonprofits. Now, by the numbers, what's interesting nationally is on the left, I have the national stats as well as the circle is the total main sectors of nonprofit on a national scale, and then compared to New York State. Nationally, the numbers come together, but truly, there's certain states have higher concentrations of nonprofit entities. So New York actually has 9% of the national total, but it is interesting to see how they compare side by side. And these are also active 501c3 establishments versus any nonprofit. These nonprofits take up a good chunk of the private sector. Nationally, they are almost 10% of the national sector. In the New York State, it is 5%. And they also contribute a good amount of jobs, over almost 13 million nationally, and then 1.3 jobs New York statewide. And interestingly enough, the largest sector in the nonprofit is healthcare and social assistance. And an important note there, the reason it is so exorbitant is because social assistance also includes some human services and social services that may or may not be directly affiliated with healthcare. So now diving into the Rochester region. There's some more definitions to share as well as an economic overview. And then I have some high-level statistics about the nonprofits and very high-level next steps to share. So defining the scope of the Rochester region was an interesting trajectory to take on since from the Greater Rochester Enterprise, they measure economic development and potential through 9 counties. But United Way specifically cites 6 counties, and also the Rochester Area Community Foundation cites 7 to 8, depending on the search I'm looking for. What I did find is while United Way cites 6, there are certain cases where other counties the neighboring counties are grouped into some of those studies. So for this purpose of this, I'm sticking with the 9 counties in what I'm measuring. Another important antidote for United Way is a lot of the charities, while they might be based in one county, they service their neighboring counties, so it all works together. From an economic statistics standpoint, the Great Rochester region of 9 counties has 1.2 million residents. Of a labor force that is about 50% of that at 607, 958 people. Only 443, 855 are current employees according to GRE's website. And there's also both for-profit and nonprofit. There's over 35,000 establishments. And a note here is that establishments are individual locations that have people employed, but those individual locations can be a part of a larger conglomerate or company. So one nonprofit example is that Rochester Regional Health is one entity, but has 557 establishments throughout our region. And of the number of employees previously cited, approximately 25% of the employees in Rochester are in the nonprofit sector. The top industries of both for-profit and nonprofit are healthcare and social services, manufacturing, education, which includes K through 12 and higher education and other trade school and other vocational entities, and retail, which is a very broad category. The smaller box is the number of establishments, which goes back to the first slide of the individual locations throughout our Rochester region, and then the number of jobs throughout the establishments. As you can see, healthcare and social services take the cake with the most jobs produced, and education is the next nonprofit sector that is very interesting to see that 28% of the total establishments in the top 4 are half of them are nonprofit. So you can already see how much nonprofit is pretty vital to our region in terms of employment and providing jobs. From a great source called Cause IQ, diving into the entities that are designated as 501c3, after playing around with the filter and getting a close number, I was able to determine that there is just over 5,000 501c3 nonprofits in our Rochester metro region. Within those and following within those, the main nonprofit categories are education, health and human services to follow the same trajectory that other sites have done in combining the two. We have arts and culture, and then there's 60 foundations, which are a combination of corporate, community, and private. A note I wanted to make here is that on Cause IQ, there is a lot of subcategories, and those subcategories can differ from other areas that report on some of these industries. So as one example, the GRE combines healthcare and human services as one conglomerate. On Cause IQ, there's about 5 distinct different categories calling out behavioral health and mental health, hospital systems, healthcare, and healthcare. In some of these cases, certain entities are checked across multiple categories that without proper reviewing get double or they get counted multiple duplicates or triple. So as I was going through that filtering, I wanted to make sure I wasn't double or triple counting as I was pulling these numbers for today's presentation. The income distribution on the left is the total for Rochester for for-profit and nonprofit. As you can see, these numbers were pulled from the GRE, and I decided to combine these ranges, but on their site, they have them broken out in smaller categories. But we have 2 large bookends of practically part-time, lower end income, and then really great exorbitant income that exceeds 6 figures or exceeds 100,000. Overall, the average household income in our region is 69,547. And when you look at this total income distribution and then you compare it to some nonprofit categories and average salary ranges, these were pulled considering the general workforce and I want to emphasize too that their average salary ranges rather than the full range. Healthcare is a typical range of 60 to 75,000. Social workers, if it's entry level or with a master's degree, has a broader range to work with. Education is in the same boat. Those numbers were pulled based on teachers' level of teaching and experience, but working in higher ed, I found that some of this range can include the average, higher ed salary as well. And then arts and culture follows a similar format to social workers of entry level to masters. And now looking at some of the larger employers in our area that are registered as nonprofits, some of them have conducted economic impact studies, which are great starting points for what this study is intending to kick off to on a broader level. U of R combined with URMC and its affiliates is the top employer in the Rochester region with 29,000 employees and also a top 5 private employer in New York State. They tie with NYU Langhorne Hospital as well. They averaged 290 million in capital investments, and their total labor income is 3.5 billion. And their effect with purchasing, as this great screenshot shows, is that they're purchasing and put more money back into our local economy as well as neighboring counties and areas in the state. Rochester Regional Health also had, luckily, a very recent report done on their economic impact, and they are slightly behind URMC with 27,000 jobs generated. Their economic activity exceeds $5 million, and their tax dollars, which is from essentially the payment of employees and the hospitals operating, is also great for our local economy and the community benefit, and they also significantly benefit our community with a little over $600 million. As they are seeking to receive funding, they also are a grant-making entity, so they also invest in the community. Some funding sources too. So echoing what was demonstrated earlier, the breakdown of where these entities receive their funding. RRH is a great follows that same format shared, where their number one source of funding is from their program services. And of that 1.5 billion, the majority is patient revenue, followed by rental of items used to serve patients. Their School of Nursing generates some for them, as well as their research. And then their second is grants and contributions. Of those grants, 56 of the 75 million are government related, but then the remaining are donations or from religious organizations. And then they have reported 53.2 million in investments with the following categories. And these numbers were pulled from Cause IQ, which does a really great breakdown and is referencing the form, their Form 990s that are submitted and publicly available. And another great funding resource to look at is our RIT President's Report. Every year they report on any campaign or donations. And this is also a great example of why it's good to know where the money's coming from, and also helps inform, particularly in our case, maybe why some certain decisions or actions are being taken. So on the left, when we have percentage of dollar raised by donor type, we have a pretty good breakdown of categories coming from foundations, trustees, the alumni, generous alumni, and generous corporations, and a private section. And then for dollars raised by research and government, currently over half of our funding from that is federal, which is certainly a cause for some concern as we're looking at the current state and how we're moving forward. But it is good to see the other diversification of where the dollars are coming from and how we're beginning to counteract that. Then just a full summary of a pestle analysis of our Rochester region. Politically, we have some active local policy on funding, climate, and housing that is helpful for the nonprofits, but there is still a reliance on government grants that certainly needs to be explored with the current state. Economically, we have modest income and slow growth. The main industry cited earlier of the region, specifically manufacturing, that has actually been on a downturn. While there are some initiatives coming down the road to increase that, that has been on a decline since the big three have reduced in size, and that has certainly impacted our economic state. High poverty also drives some demand for nonprofit services, and inflation certainly plays a part in making things more challenging. Social, same with high poverty. There's some major disparities in our area. We also have a major aging population. Just as it noted that 50% of our total population is workforce, that indicates that a good amount of the population is, while there's also our youths, we also have a lot of retired folks who are living their best life in the Rochester region, and they need services that a lot of these nonprofits provide. Nonprofits also act as a critical safety net, but it's difficult to be that safety net without proper resources. Technologically speaking, we have a strong tech sector that's only getting stronger, and nonprofits have done a great job adopting digital tools and starting to integrate more data analysis and thorough research in some of their efforts. But there is still some resource constraints because some of those tools do not come cheap. Environmentally, there's always climate risks. And so there has been an energy burden that is upon us all, and also some funding for sustainability initiatives, which that one is probably that one's a little more in limbo. On a legal side, there are definitely complex regulations. For a nonprofit in particular, it's operating on minimal cost, but maximizing services is more challenging than it is to say that. And of course, changing labor and employment laws just continue that tradition of complex regulations for a nonprofit entity. Some very high level next steps. From assessing all of this data and finding a way to summarize it, I think it's very important for nonprofits and for us to re-examine the government partnerships. There are some really great initiatives being set up, but at the same time, if the funding is too if the funding overtakes the mission, then we find ourselves in the state we are now, where you have entities that have to reassess their mission to make sure they're aligning with a grantee who is changing the terms of their payment. Just as it was in the beginning of history where there was more independence and a directive without purse strings attached, that's certainly something worth considering down the road of acting more as collaborative partners and maybe ensuring the funding doesn't influence decisions or considering alternative funding. Data transparency and shared terms are also a huge opportunity area. There certainly needs to be clarity in some of these nonprofit categories just from digging through this data and summarizing it for everyone today. There definitely, I saw that to be a major opportunity area of having a better way of distinguishing healthcare, social work, what the arts and cultures are. As one example, I had seen the really great entity, Genesee Valley Country Museum. They are a site that works to preserve history, but I've seen them on a site identified as an environmental group, which I believe some of their cause does serve that purpose. But when one entity is being defined by multiple categories, it's not only hard to measure their impact for moments like this, but it's also hard to build awareness for others to then support their mission. Also in terms of counties, I would recommend that all the entities working together, that we find a way to find the shared terms of which counties we count for Rochester region, or having clear distinction of why, if one is eliminated, what the causes are. Just thinking back to the United Way example, some charities might not exist in those counties, even though the charities serve those counties. But having that clear distinction is very helpful. And then for examining governance, touching on it more here than earlier, but there's a lot of opportunity to examine internally how some nonprofits are run to also improve efficiency. Considering the structure of boards and decision-making that can also consider the revenue generating and long-term commitments of everybody involved. If a board is volunteer run and short terms, it's very hard to make positive long-term decisions if people don't have any kind of fiscal commitment to those outcomes. This would be an area too where there is the opportunity to combine some business acumen with running, including the business side of the nonprofit sector. And most importantly, it's just continuing to do the work. This project for me, this was me dedicating my time for an independent study. It's not paid research. There's a lot of other classes that I know too that a lot more people are interested in their social impact and how their work impacts the community they're in, and they would love to integrate it with schoolwork or their time for free. So this would be an alternative way to dive deeper into some of these topics or gain secondary insight for a nonprofit. So it's not, the pressure is not all on the entity to go do the work. And it's really important for all of us to be investing in our community. It's not just on the nonprofits to deliver the services and figure it out under constraints. It really takes all of us recognizing what's really going on and coming together and finding ways to solve and identify solutions. So to finish on that, a great quote from one of my sources of this study is, if there is a lesson from history, it's that philanthropy enlarges democracy when it is active, and it is active in which there's many that participate. And that was it. Thank you so much. And I see that I have a question in the chat, and I'm happy to go. So from John Strebeck, he asked, did I find in my research a great deal of overlap among some nonprofits in certain sectors? Absolutely. The biggest one with the main sector of healthcare and human services, that's where there was certainly a lot of overlap, particularly in Rochester. There is quite a lot of caregiving. There's a lot of caregiving entities. And the main question there that I would love to dive deeper on as I continue this work outside of here is understanding if those caregiving entities are truly serving different groups, or if they have different services, or maybe there is an opportunity for them to come together and leverage each other's resources. So if one entity does one sort of care better, well, they can create a referral network to help anybody that is looking for home care or looking for a certain service that they may provide. I would say the biggest one I observed with our Rochester region was care relating to the elderly. I would say yes, especially. So the question was, is it because the sector is so broad as my data showed? Yes, it's, I think it's also that they combined sectors where with how hospitals or how our health organizations are also becoming organized with hospital, labs, doctors' offices, sometimes those establishments are separately identified, and those are causing some of the multi-category the multi-category double and triple counts. And then you have a human service that might have a partnership with healthcare, and it's getting looped in, but it's separate from the hospital entity. So there definitely was some interesting overlap, and it does seem, I'm wondering too if that's another thing to dive into, is why that sector is currently defined so broadly when there's so much more to it. Then Peggy Terrell asked, did you come across any barriers to set up a nonprofit that prevent them from moving forward? So my research was definitely focusing more on defining them. And I think that's really what the next step is right now, from everything I found, I haven't found any recent example of barriers, but right now from just defining everything, it would definitely be more about how, ooh, pardon me, if they started to veer away from their mission. So I don't know if it answers the question. The only thing I can think of is if a nonprofit was trying to sign up as a 501c3, but their cause really aligned as a different designation. That's another thing that's interesting with those designations of 501c3 versus 4 and the other numbers is, especially with 501c4 saying social welfare, where that is also a term that's used for public interest. But then when they define which of those causes are 501c4, they're very focused in a specific community rather than serving a public interest that can be transferable anywhere. Ooh, and thank you. Yes, the pestle was a great analysis tool to use. But happy to answer any other questions for people as we are here. Obviously, I did not go the full time that I set. See if there's any Q&A. Right. Well, thank you everybody for coming today. I am hoping to provide more of these. I'm hoping this sparks a conversation. I'm doing some work with Lydia and Jerry Ann to continue this initiative, and this was really just meant to be a starting point to have the conversation for our Rochester region and maybe even inspire the conversation for other regions for those of you tuning in out of state. And until the next time. So thank you all very much.